Hi, this is Debbie and I have a tutorial over at Old to New using some heat embossing and some watercolouring with this beautiful vintage teacup set, and I'm going to share it here on my YouTube channel and blog as well. I'm going to be using the stamp set and the matching dies today. I've placed the teacup and the saucer on the door of the Mini Misty, and I've got a piece of Saunders Waterford cold press watercolour card in the Misty, and I've treated that with EK Success powder tool because I'm going to heat emboss, and the powder tool will prevent embossing powder sticking where you don't want it to. I've stamped the images with clear embossing ink, and I often do that several times because cold press watercolour card is textured. I like to do it several times to make sure I get a really good impression, and then I'm going to sprinkle the images with some antique gold embossing powder, and then giving that a good tap off before bringing it to my heat tool to melt the embossing powder. I've then lined up the matching dies and kept those in place with washi before running it through the Big Shot machine to die cut. The vintage teacups that I remember my mother and grandmother having not only had the gold accents, which I'm representing with the gold heat embossing, but they also often had small flowers dotted around the cup and the saucer. And so I've taken the larger flower from the vintage teacup set, and I'm going to stamp that in some Old to New blush ink onto the front of the teacup. Being light in colour, the blush ink will give me a guide as to where to watercolour, but because the outline will be light in colour, by the time I finish watercolouring, you won't be able to see it, and therefore it'll give a no-line watercolour look to the flower. I've also stamped the smaller flower twice, once on either side of the saucer. And now with all the stamping complete, it's time to turn to the watercolouring. I'm using my usual palette of watercolours, which have a combination of Schminke, Daniel Smith, Winsor & Newton and Daler Rowney paints. In my mind's eye, vintage teacups often had very pastel colours in gradients from the deepest tones at the base of the teacup and then working up to the rim. And so I'm starting out with a very light wash of Daniel Smith Quinacridone Coral, which is a lovely pink colour, and I'm making sure that I give the deepest tones to the bottom of the teacup and to the edges of the saucer. Although I'm intending my teacup to be white with a pink gradient, I still need to add in some shadows into the white areas of the cup and saucer to make it look more realistic and three-dimensional. And so I'm using a very light wash of sepia paint and adding that into the white areas of the teacup and saucer. Having got the base layer down, I'm now going to dry that with a heat tool before starting to add the details of the flowers. I'm going to play some music now while I continue to watercolour. I'm going to be using my usual style of lots of light layers, slowly building up the depth of colour. After finishing the watercolouring, I went in with some Faber-Castell polychromos to add some details and some depth to the shadows. I want to place the teacup on a watercoloured panel of watercolour card which has torn edges, and to get the torn edge look, you take a piece of watercolour card and fold it, and then you go backwards and forwards, folding it and folding it, turning it over, folding it, and you need to do that maybe up to 20 times, and that breaks up the fibres of the watercolour card so that when you tear it, you get that nice soft torn edge. Before watercolouring this panel though, I'm going to stamp the sentiment, and I've lined up the sentiment on the door of the Misty, treated the card with EK Success powder tool again, stamped in clear embossing ink, made sure I get that a good impression, stamped backwards and forwards a couple of times, and then sprinkle some antique gold embossing powder on top and heat set the embossing powder with my heat tool. I often get asked about soft watercolour backgrounds, and I think the key is just lots of light layers. I start in with a really light layer of blue, dry that off, come in with a slightly deeper tone, getting some nice watery edges and hard edges, and then I keep going backwards and forwards, and then I finish off with some splatters. I've splattered with some of the blue paint and also some Heidi Colour Shining Gold. I did want to finish this card off by getting the steam rising from the teacup, but that means that I'm going to have to stamp the image twice, once on the teacup and once on the background. And so I'm lining up where I want the steam image to be and where I'm going to place the teacup on the background. And once that's all lined up, I can close the door of the MISTI and then stamp that on the teacup and the background. I'm going to use some Mocha ink from Old to New, and I'm going to stamp that a couple of times on the background and then line it up over the teacup and stamp it again on the teacup. And because I planned where I wanted the steam and the teacup to be, it means that once I've done that, I can then line them up and the teacup and steam will be in the right place. I've added foam adhesive to the back of both images. Normally I would lay down the saucer first and then the teacup on top, but because I want to line up the steam correctly, I've attached the teacup first, but only the top of the teacup, and then taken off the foam backer from the base of the teacup so that I can tuck the saucer underneath in the correct place. And then finally I've added lots of foam adhesive to the back of the watercoloured panel and then attached that to a side folding craft card base. I added a few sequins to accent and attached those with Range Multimedia and Matte, and that finishes this vintage teacup watercolour card inspired by the teacups of my grandmother and mother. I'll leave links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you'd subscribe to this channel. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.